Wet boots vibrate in the nursery, making my ears bleed with a dry scratching sound that isn't tea coming from the wall. It's as the vinyl floor beneath me, cold and sticky with old sweat, resonating with the radio static humming at 45 hertz. The static isn't just noise. It's a physical thing, a low thrumming in my molars like the hum of a broken transformer. I trace the nursery floor with bare toes, the vinyl cool and slightly tacky, each step leaving a faint imprint. The radio crackles, a distorted lullaby about stitching walls, threading through the static, the words almost drowned by the hiss. My fingernail catches on a loose thread, wine, red, thick as old blood, smelling faintly of iron and damp wool. I press the phone harder against my ear, the static swallowing my breath. Snick, a sharp snap embeds my nail into the quilt. Thread, the sound sharp as shattering glass. I feel the resistance, the rough weave of the quilt snagging my skin, then the sudden warmth as my nail slits. Blood wells up, thick and slow, dripping onto the quilt. Surface. The blood mixes with the thread stain, turning the wine, red into something darker, almost black, like congealed syrup. The radio static rises in pitch, the lullaby distorting into something that sounds like a whisper. Asterisk, stitch the walls, stitch the walls. Asterisk, I pull my finger back, watching the blood drip onto the dark oak floorboards, each drop leaving a tiny crimson circle that spreads like a stain in water. The vinyl floor creaks under my weight as I shift, the dry scratching sound from the wall intensifying. Scratching like a fingernail dragged slowly over wood, rhythmic, deliberate. I don't. To look toward the wall. I can tee. My eyes stay fixed on the quilt, on the blood mixing with the thread, the wine. Red thread seems to pulse faintly in the dim light, the color deepening as the blood seeps into it. The radio static modulates again, the 45 hertz hum vibrating through my bones, making the dry scratching sound louder, closer. I feel the blood on my finger, sticky and warm, and I press it harder against the quilt, feeling the rough texture of the thread beneath my skin. The blood mixes with the thread, the two becoming indistinguishable, the quilt seeming to breathe beneath my touch. The dry scratching stops. The radio static cuts out for a moment, leaving only the sound of my own breathing shallow and fast. Then the radio crackles back to life, the lullaby returning, the words clearer now. Asterisk, stitch the walls. Stitch the walls. Asterisk, I pull my finger away from the quilt, the blood leaving a small dark mark on the fabric. The wine. Red thread glows faintly in the dim light, the blood mixing with it, the color shifting from red to black. I feel the blood on my finger, warm and sticky, and I press it back against the quilt, feeling the rough weave of the thread, the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears, loud and fast. The radio static rises again, the 45 hertz hum vibrating through the floorboards, the dry scratching sound returning, softer now, almost like a whisper. I close my eyes, the blood on my finger mixing with the thread, the quilt breathing beneath my touch. The dry scratching stops. The radio static cuts out. The silence is absolute. Then the sound of my own blood dripping onto the dark oak floor, each drop echoing in the stillness. Her own blood mixes with the thread, a stain. The needle slips again. The quilt's thread, thick as the sinews of a butchered thing, resists the steel tip, the wine red dye bleeding past my fingers in slow, deliberate rivulets. Each stitch is a violation, a tiny incision where the fabric's future should have been. The table beneath me thumps a wet, fleshy sound, like a heart pressed against the underside of wood. My pulse answers it, hammering against my wrists where the quilt's ink stains my skin. The warmth of it spreads, viscous and alive, as if the fabric itself is weeping into me. I should stop. The ink isn't just dye, it's proof. The first time I saw the cell door in the quilt's embroidery, it wasn't ink. It was sandblood. A perfect, stitched replica of the metal gate outside my door, the bars rendered in crimson thread so precise they could have been pressed from memory. And then the ink started bleeding. Not from the thread, from soot in mine. My palms would split open after handling it, thin cracks like spiderwebs, and the quilt would drink the blood as if it were thirsty. Now the tears in the fabric match the tears in my skin, and the stitches I make are stitches I'll need to undo later. The table thump, sud again. The rhythm is wrong, too slow, too deliberate. I press my ear against the wood, feeling the vibration crawl up my forearm like a parasite. No clock ticks here, no mechanical precision. This is organic. This is or alive. The grain of the table darkens beneath my cheek, the oak swelling with something wet, something that isn't sap. My breath fogs the surface, but the condensation doesn't bead. It clings as thick as oil before sliding down in slow, greasy trails. The quilt shifts on my lap, the thread pulling taut as if something beneath it is struggling. I ignore it. The needle pierces again. This time, the thread doesn't resist. It twid yields the wine-red ink parting like flesh before the needle's edge. My palm stings not from the stitch, but from the ink's warmth. It's not dye. It's sweet liquid, and it's choosing me. The table thumps it to the sound syncs with my breath now, a slow, wet cadence that makes my ribs ache. I can't stop. If I stop, the quilt will finish stitching itself without me. It'll stitch the door. It'll stitch the lock. It'll stitch the lock. It'll stitch me inside. The ink bleeds faster. My fingers are slippery with it, the quilt's embroidery drinking deeper, the cell door's bars darkening into something blacker than blood. The thread pulls, the needle snagging, and the quilt twitches beneath my hands, not from the stitch. From something else, a shift in the fabric, a wrongness in the weave, like the quilt is remembering how to breathe. The table thumps. The sound is louder now, a wet feather that vibrates through the floorboards, through my bones, through the quilt stitches. My vision swims. The ink bleeds past my knuckles, past my wrists, the quilt's thread drinking it in like a wound licking at a cut. The cell door in the embroidery isn't just a door anymore. It's a 40-mouth. The bars its teeth, the lock its tongue, and it's opening. I don't pull away. The quilt's thread tightens. The needle slips again, the ink bleeding in thick, slow drops onto my palm. The table twiver thumps the sound drowning out my breath, the quilt stitches pulling me under. The ink is warm now, pulsing against my skin like a second heartbeat. The cell door in the quilt's embroidery moves in. The bars part, the lock unravels, and the ink bleeds from my palm into the fabric, the wine red turning black as the quilt stitches itself into me. The table thumps, and the quilt stitches the door shut. The blade finds the table's heart before I do. My wrist twists, the knife's edge biting into the oak, with a sound like a mouth opening on wet leather. Frithwack. The wood shuddering beneath my palm. The grain splits clean, the scent of it sharp and green, like the inside of a rotten apple left too long in the dark. My fingers slick with something darker than sap, the table's breath slowing, then stopping. No pulse, no heartbeat. Just the static hum of the radio, a white noise that slithers into my ears like a tongue tasting the air. I press closer. The radio's voice cuts through the fuzz, a woman's laugh from 1963. Sweet and chemical, the kind of voice that sells things you don't, to need but can live without. Asterisk hand, stitched quilts ward off infection. Asterisk the ad repeats, the static swallowing the words whole, but not before the last syllable, infection, drags out like a scream. My fingers tighten around the knife. The quilt lies folded on the bed, its edges bleeding wine, red into the sheets. I can almost hear it whispering, "For you, re the infection now." Asterisk the table vibrates, not under my hands, for through me. The wood isn't just alive. It, fui listening. The grain darkens where the blade cut it, the fissure widening like a wound, the edges glistening with something thick and dark. Not blood, not sap, something older. The table's heartbeat thuds against my ribs, a slow, wet thump. The rhythm of a drowning man. I press my ear to the split, the wood warm against my skin, and for a second I swear I hear it. Not mine. Not the cat. The table's the knife slips. I don't to pull it out. The blade sinks deeper, the wood groaning like a man being forced into a coffin. The static from the radio sharpens, the voices inside it twisting. Asterisk infection. Ward, quilt, blood. Stitch asterisk. The words stitching themselves into my skull. The table's heartbeat syncs with the radio's pulse, a slow, deliberate futhaded that makes my teeth ache. I drive the knife harder, the wood resisting, then giving way with a sound like wet parchment tearing. The blade hits something solid beneath bone maybe, or the table's own black heart. The glass shatters. I didn't throw it. It wasn't there before. The bottle, some old liquor, the label long since dissolved, splinters across the table's surface, the jagged edges biting into my thigh like teeth. Pain blooms, hot and copper, tasting, the blood welling dark against the oak. The quilt shifts on the bed, the thread pulling taut as if something beneath it is wonder laughing. The ink spreads from my palm, seeping into the quilt's weave like mercury. The cell door in the embroidery isn't just a door anymore. It's a fourth wall, the bars now jagged teeth, the lock a yawning mouth. The stitches move, the thread unraveling, the wine, red ink turning black as it drinks the blood from my thigh. The table funchy, the sound isn't teeth from the wood. It's from 2v My breath hitches, the radio static screaming now, the voices inside it sobbing, asterisk, stitch, 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 asterisk like a chant. The quilt thread tightens, the embroidery pulling at my skin, the ink crawling up my arm like a vine. The wall in the quilt isn't just a wall. It ain't my wall. The cracks in the plaster match the cracks in the table, grain. The blood matching the ink. The radio's voice breaks into a wail, asterisk ward off infection, asterisk and the table's heartbeat slows, the wood swelling, the split closing like a mouth sealing shut. I don't. To pull the knife out. The quilt stitches the wall, and the wall stitches me inside. The golden shimmer wasn't a reflection. It moved a slow, deliberate drift across the floorboards, like oil slicked across water. The cat, of course. Its fur, impossibly bright against the dark oak, left no trace, no displaced dust motes, as it navigated the room. It wasn't walking so much as flowing, the golden current tracing a path I hadn't noticed before, a rhythm, a purpose. A low hum resonated from the Tibetan bowl on the mantelpiece, a sound that felt less heard and more food absorbed it into the bone. Fudung. The cat paused, its head cocked, and the bowl resonated again, mirroring the cadence of its movements. Dong dong. Each chime seemed to pull at the edges of the room, stretching the shadows, sharpening the angles. It wasn't responding to me or the room, but to something else, a frequency I couldn't quite grasp. I followed, my bare feet cold against the wood. The air tasted metallic, a faint tang of copper clinging to the back of my throat. The cat moved towards the wall opposite the bed, the one I'd been avoiding. The quilt lay spread on the floor, its wine-red threads seeming to pulse with a life of their own. The cat's fur brushed against the fabric, leaving a temporary impression, a golden ghost of its passage. Fudon. The bowl resonated, and the cat began to trace a pattern, not random, not a hunt. It was mapping. The first path, a shimmering line across the floor, began to resemble something familiar. A floor plan. The room's layout, but not as it twendy. Is it twend? As it twend cold? I knelt, tracing the golden path with my finger. The cat ignored me, continuing its meticulous work. The lines converged, forming angles, defining spaces. A doorway here, a window there, a cell. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The cat wasn't charting the room, it was charting a faisal. A small, confined space. And as I followed the pattern, the sickening truth dawned. It wasn't just any cell. It was someday my room, inverted. The bed where the quilt had been, now a solid wall. The window, a narrow slit. The door, a barred gate. The quilt's threads seemed to writhe, the wine red deepening to a bruised plum. I could feel the pattern in my teeth, a gritty pressure against the enamel. The cat paused, its golden eyes fixed on the quilt. A slow blink, and then it resumed its work, its fur weaving the final lines, completing the map. My breath hitched, caught in my chest. It wasn't just a map, it was a foot in prediction. A blueprint. The cat's movements weren't random, they were deliberate, purposeful. It was designing my prison, and I was letting it. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of dust and something else, something floral and cloying like overripe fruit. The quilt's embroidery, the tiny stitched scenes of idyllic landscapes, seemed to shift and distort, the trees twisting into gnarled claws, the fields becoming endless rows of graves. The cell door in the embroidery, the one I'd dismissed as a quaint detail, wasn't quaint anymore. It was a gaping maw, the bars now jagged teeth, the lock a dark, hungry eye. The cat's fur traced the outline of my future prison with unsettling precision. A corner here, a narrow alcove there. The placement of the bars, the angle of the gate. It was meticulous, artistic almost, loving. A craftsman perfecting its work. I pressed my hand against the quilt, the fabric cool and slick. The threads tightened, pulling at my skin. A gentle but insistent pressure. The ink, the same wine, red as the quilt, began to seep into the weave, spreading like a stain. It wasn't just staining the fabric, it was already becoming the fabric, becoming food in my. The room throbbed. A slow, wet, twin thump, 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 that echoed the rhythm of the bowl's resonance. It wasn't the house settling, it wasn't my heart. It was the quilt. The quilt was breathing. The cat finished its work, its fur tracing the final line, completing the cell's perimeter. It sat back, regarding its creation with an air of quiet satisfaction. The golden fur shimmered, reflecting the distorted image of my room, my future, my prison, Donga. The bowl resonated, a final decisive chime, and the cat's fur traced new cell layout on quilt. Her cell, inverted. The phone receiver hums in my ear, a low, pulsating drone that seems to echo the rhythm of my heartbeat. I press it tighter against my skin, as if trying to absorb the sound into my flesh. The radio static whispers again for Beatrice, this time clearer, more insistent. It is like an invitation, a summons. I feel something warm trickling down my cheek. I reach up with my free hand and touch it, expecting tears. But it is not salt water that coats my fingertips. It is thick, viscous liquid, wine red. The same shade as the quilt's embroidery threads. It drips from my ear canal, tracing a path along my jawline before falling onto the quilt below. The quilt seems to absorb the droplets, each one leaving behind a tiny stain that spreads like an inky bruise. I watch, hypnotized by this silent communion between fabric and fluid. The threads seem to writhe beneath the surface, shifting and twisting as if trying to form patterns within their stained confines. A sudden noise jars me from my trance, a dry scratching sound echoing through the phone line. It is not static, it is too deliberate for that. Too furry like sandpaper on wood, or nails scraping against glass. I pull the receiver away from my ear, listening intently. The sound doesn't stop. Instead, it grows louder, more insistent. I stand up abruptly, the kitchen chair screeching across the linoleum floor behind me. My breath catches in my throat as a realization hits. That sound, it is coming from inside Divi, the walls. Not just my bedroom wall, they're all at it now. Scratching, scraping, clawing at the plaster from every direction. The room throbs with their exertion, each stroke vibrating through the phone line and into my ear canal like a second heartbeat. The sound is accompanied by another sensation, heat. A slow creeping warmth that radiates outwards from where I'm standing, seeping into my bones until it feels as though I am being cooked alive. The Tibetan bowl on the mantelpiece resonates. Suddenly its deep predond echoing through the room like a warning bell tolling in reverse. The cat appears at my feet, its golden fur shimmering like oil under the dim overhead light. It looks up at me with those unblinking eyes, then turns towards the wall where the scratching is loudest. I follow it, my bare feet cold against the wood floorboards now slicked with sweat from the heat. The cat's tail flicks back and forth like a metronome set to allegro tempo, its tip jagged as broken glass. It traces patterns in midair that seem eerily familiar, lines intersecting at precise angles, defining spaces within an invisible grid. The scratching stops abruptly when I reach the wall opposite my bed, the one marked out by the cat's movements earlier today. But it doesn't remain silent for long. A new sound begins, a low, rhythmic tapping like wet parchment tearing in slow motion. The noise grows louder until each tap is accompanied by an audible faint splatter, sending splashes of wine red onto the quilt laid out beneath. I realize what is happening just as another drop falls from my ear canal, this time landing directly on one of those stitched scenes embroidered into the fabric below me. The threads seem to greedily absorb it, expanding and contracting like tiny lungs inhaling life, giving oxygen. The room is alive with sound now, the scratching at the walls, the tapping above me, my own ragged breaths echoing off the bare plaster. And yet there is something else too, a high-pitched whine that seems to vibrate through every molecule in existence. It starts low but rises steadily, until it feels as though my skull will fracture under its pressure. I'm dimly aware of heat pooling behind my eyes, of liquid dripping down my cheeks and neck, but mostly I am aware sufadi, of the sensation that something is being born inside me, forcing itself outwards through every available orifice. My skin feels too tight suddenly. My lungs burn as they struggle to expand against unseen constraints. And then, silence. The scratching stops mid-stroke, the tapping cuts off abruptly halfway through its descent. Even my own breath hangs suspended in my throat like a trapped bird fluttering desperately for escape. Only that high-pitched whine remains, now so loud it is deafening, an infinite scream held captive within an empty room. I feel something shift beneath me. The quilt, my feet, the very foundations of the house itself, and then, with a suddenness that steals my breath away entirely, treachery scratching. Like sandpaper on wood, the wine-red blossoms on the quilt deepened with each droplet, the crimson spreading like a slow bloom of internal bruising. I pressed the needle through the dark oak-colored fabric, a deliberate puncture, not to create the embroidered image, but to feel it, to mirror the sensation on my own skin. The thread snagged, resisting the pull, then yielded with a soft fin snap. It wasn't pain I sought, but resonance. A matching ache. The table, a heavy squat thing carved from a single piece of wood, pulsed beneath my fingertips. Fun thump, thump, thump. A slow, deliberate rhythm that had begun subtly, a ghost in the grain, but now resonated with the beat of my own heart. It wasn't a sound so much as a vibration, a deep thrumming that traveled up my arm and settled in my chest, a sympathetic echo. I leaned closer, my ear almost touching the polished surface, and the rhythm solidified, growing stronger, more insistent. Thump, thump, thump. It was becoming familiar, comforting even. The air tasted metallic, a faint tang of iron that coated the back of my tongue. I traced the embroidered scene with a fingertip, a depiction of a sterile room, all angles and harsh light. A room I hadn't consciously envisioned yet felt intimately connected to. Within the scene, a figure hovered unmistakably me. Foodie was meticulously stitching a wall, building something, containing something. The thread in my hand felt thick, almost viscous, each stitch a reinforcement. A lullaby surfaced unbidden, a melody from a childhood I barely remembered. It rasped from my throat, a broken cadence, as I continued to work. The table's pulse synced with the song, the thump, 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 now a counterpoint to the fragile tune. The quilt's fabric felt strangely warm, almost feverish. It breathed. I could feel it expanding and contracting beneath my fingers. The golden cat, a shimmering presence in the dim light, moved with languid grace. It circled the table, its body brushing against my legs. The texture of its fur wasn't soft, but slick, like polished stone. Its movements weren't random. It traced the perimeter of the room, its body a living compass defining the boundaries. It wasn't observing me, but timely measuring the space, calculating dimensions. I glanced at the scene on the quilt, focusing on the figure stitching the wall. The image wasn't static, it shifted, resolved, clarified. The wall wasn't simply being built, it was being sealed. A cell, and I, the figure in the embroidery, was the architect. My hands, the ones holding the needle, were not creating art, but constructing confinement. A wave of heat washed over me, originating not from the room, but from within my own body. My skin prickled, tightened. It felt like something was growing, expanding, pressing against the limits of my flesh. A bloom of heat mirroring the blossoms on the quilt. The table's rhythm accelerated, becoming a frantic drumbeat. Thump, 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 thump. I didn't resist. I welcomed it. The sensation of growth, the warmth, the pressure. It felt right, necessary. The needle moved on its own, guided by an unseen force. The wine-red droplets fell onto the quilt, each one absorbed into the fabric, strengthening the image. The room, the cell, my work. It was all connected. I pressed my hand flat against the table, feeling the vibration surge through me. It was a summons, a promise. The air grew thick, viscous, heavy with the scent of iron and something else. Something ancient and sweet. The image on the quilt solidified, the scene of me stitching the wall now perfectly clear, the lines sharp and defined. I was building a prison, but not for others, for myself. The table's rhythm was no longer echoing my own pulse. It was my pulse. I looked down at the quilt, at the image of me stitching, and then I saw it. The same scene, unfolding within the scene. A smaller, more detailed depiction of the same room, the same wall, the same figure fighting me stitching. A loop, an endless cycle of construction, of confinement, of creation. The room felt smaller now, the walls closer, the air unbreathable. The table's pulse had become deafening. The quilt's fabric pulsed beneath my hands, dry scratching like sandpaper on wood. The chair felt brittle under my weight, the cane seat groaning a protest as I lifted it. It wasn't anger fueling the movement, not exactly. More expedience, a necessary act of demolition. The table had become too insistent, the pulse a possessive hand on my chest. I swung. The impact resonated through the room, a high, crystalline, fine-ping pin that splintered the silence. Not a clean break, the wood resisting, but a fracturing, a web of cracks spiderwebbing across the polished surface. More sweeping Sioux followed, each one like the striking of a bowed cymbal, strangely beautiful and unsettling. Fragments of dark oak flew, landing with the softest of fuintedsi on the woven rug. Glass shattered, not from a window, but from the small, ornate bottles I'd collected, displayed on the table. Perfume, mostly their delicate scents a lavender. Rose, something acrid and metallic, mingled with the dust and the growing scent of broken wood. Each shard a tiny, glittering blade. A mosaic of destruction. The table shuddered, the rhythmic pulse faltering, becoming erratic, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. Thump, 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 thump. Then the stain appeared. It wasn't blood, not initially. More like wine, a deep, viscous crimson welling up from the center of the splintered wood. It spread, blooming across the surface, consuming the grain, the broken glass, everything. It moved with a disturbing fluidity, not pooling, but swift and flowing as if the wood itself were bleeding. And the cat, it hadn't moved. It sat, a statue of golden oil, watching the crimson tide. The stain reached its pores. It didn't flinch. It didn't recoil. It simply absorbed it. The golden fur darkened, saturated with a wine-red hue. It wasn't emerging, but a dissolution. The shimmering quality of the fur faded, replaced by a matte, almost porous texture. The gold wasn't being swing-covered. It was being swinty-unmatey. I watched breathless, a strange calm settling over me. The frantic drumbeat of the table had ceased. The room was quiet, save for the soft hiss of the stain spreading, the almost imperceptible slurk-fid as it consumed the cat. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of iron and something else, something ancient and cloying like overripe fruit. The cat's form lost its definition. The sleek lines blurred, softened. It wasn't shrinking, but flattening, becoming two-dimensional. The stain wasn't simply coating it, but twinting it, pressing it into the surface of the quilt. The quilt. I hadn't truly looked at it since I'd begun stitching, lost in the rhythm, the heat, the growing sense of rightness. Now, I saw it clearly. The embroidered room, the sterile walls, the figure stitching, and beneath it, the pattern, the layout. The quilt wasn't a depiction Subi of Fizz. Something. It was a blueprint, a map. And the stain consuming the cat was tracing the lines of that map. The cat's body was almost entirely subsumed, only a sliver of golden fur remaining, a thin line delineating a path, a precise route across the room. The stain followed, mirroring the line, the crimson deepening, solidifying. It wasn't random, it wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. The cat's path became the quilt's path. The embroidered lines on the fabric glowed faintly, illuminated by the spreading stain. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in. The air tasted like dust and decay. I understood with a chilling clarity that the cat hadn't been observing the room it had been drawing. It had been drawing it, defining its boundaries. Preparing it, the final trace of golden fur disappeared. The stain was complete, a perfect crimson replica of the path embroidered on the quilt, now etched into the room itself. A path leading from the broken table, across the rug, to the far wall. The wall where I had begun the embroidery, the wall I was still building. The wall that was now, undeniably, a cell. A high-pitched, almost inaudible tone resonated, a crystalline fine-ping whine that seemed to vibrate in my bones. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling. A resonance. The quilt's fabric pulsed beneath my hands, and then I saw it. The same scene unfolding within the seam. A smaller, more detailed depiction of the same room, the same wall, the same figure me, stitching, a loop, an endless cycle of construction, of confinement, of creation. The room felt smaller now. The walls closer, the air unbreathable. The table's pulse had become deafening. The quilt's fabric pulsed beneath my hands. Dry scratching, like sandpaper on wood. "Why do you draw the walls, architect?" The question felt brittle, escaping my lips as a puff of stale air. I hadn't spoken aloud in days. The recording light on the machine pulsed a sickly green, a mocking imitation of life. The static hissed back, a white noise ocean swallowing my voice, then underneath a faint echo. Architect it, not my voice repeating it, but something else, a chorus layered and distorted, as if the very air was whispering the name. I lowered the receiver, the plastic cool against my ear. The radio, tuned to nothing, thrummed with the same static. It wasn't random, it was patterned, rhythmic, almost intentional, a broken signal attempting to coalesce into a message. The scent of wood polish, thick and cloying, clung to the air, mingling with the metallic tang that had become pervasive. It tasted like pennies on my tongue. My fingers traced the quilt, the embroidered lines cool and strangely alive beneath my touch. The room within the quilt, the one I had so painstakingly constructed with needle and thread, felt more real than the room around me. The walls, the furniture, the arrangement of objects, it was all there, perfectly rendered in miniature. And the stain, the crimson tide that had consumed the cat, mirrored the embroidered lines with unsettling precision. The fur, it wasn't simply shed, it dissolved, tidy fine golden filaments clinging to the quilt, almost invisible against the dark fabric. I ran my hand over the area where the cat had been, the quilt's surface now smooth, seamless. The texture was different, not the rough weave of the fabric, but something softer, almost organic. Like skin, I pressed harder, my fingertips sinking slightly into the quilting. The fabric pulsed beneath my touch, a slow, deliberate rhythm. Not a vibration, but a pressure. A swelling, the room felt smaller, the walls closer. The air grew heavy, saturated with the scent of iron and something else, something ancient and sweet. Overripe peaches, left to rot in the sun. The radio sputtered, a burst of static so intense it made my teeth ache. Then, a voice, not a human voice. Not exactly. A resonance, a harmonic distortion. It spoke, not in words but in frequencies. A feeling of recognition, of welcome. It was the heartbeat, I realized. The frantic drumbeat that had originated from the table, now resonating from the quilt itself. Thump, 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 thump. I followed the stain's path, the crimson line snaking across the rug towards the far wall. The wall where I had begun the embroidery, the wall I was still building. The wall that was now undeniably a boundary, a containment. The embroidered lines on the quilt glowed faintly, illuminated by the spreading stain. It wasn't a reflection of light, but an internal luminescence, as if the fabric itself was radiating energy. I touched the wall, my palm flat against the cold plaster. The texture was subtly wrong, not smooth, but granular, like finely ground bone. I pressed harder, and a section of the wall yielded slightly, giving way beneath my fingers, a faint, almost imperceptible movement. The room shifted, not physically, but perceptually. The angles altered, the proportions distorted. It was as if the walls were breathing, expanding and contracting with each pulse of the quilt. The stain reached the wall, completing the circuit. A perfect crimson replica of the path embroidered on the quilt, now etched into the room itself. The air crackled with static, the scent of iron overwhelming. The heartbeat intensified, vibrating through my bones. It wasn't just a sound, but a sensation of physical presence. It felt like a hand pressing against my chest. The room felt smaller now. The walls pressed in, suffocating. The air tasted of dust and decay. I understood with a chilling clarity that the cat hadn't been observing the room, it had been subdefining it, marking its boundaries, preparing it. The embroidered room within the quilt wasn't a depiction of something. It was a template, and I, the stitcher, was merely a conduit. The quilt's fabric pulsed beneath my hands. A high-pitched, almost inaudible tone resonated, a crystalline footing ping that seemed to vibrate in my bones. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling, a resonance. The same scene unfolding within the scene. A smaller, more detailed depiction of the same room, the same wall, the same figure footing me stitching. A loop, an endless cycle of construction, of confinement, of creation. The room felt smaller now, the walls closer, the air unbreathable. The table's pulse had become deafening. The quilt's fabric pulsed beneath my hands, dry scratching, like sandpaper on wood. The needle slipped through the fabric, a whisper of steel against the quilt's surface. It wasn't resistance I felt, but a yielding, a welcome. The crimson stain on the wall pulsed, a slow, deliberate rhythm that mirrored the thrumming in my chest. The table's heartbeat, once a distant echo, now resonated within me, a hollow drumbeat against my ribs. I hadn't smiled in how long the days bled into one another, marked only by the slow, agonizing progress of the embroidered wall. But now, a faint curve lifted the corners of my mouth. A genuine, unsettling smile. The cat watched, its golden fur shimmering in the wine-red light. Not a gaze of curiosity, but of approval. It was the missing piece. The final thread, the fur shed in those dissolving moments, clung to the quilt like powdered moonlight. It wasn't simply fur, it was a residue, a trace of something. Else I gathered the filaments, tiny, almost invisible, and laid them upon the quilt's surface. The needle plunged again, a precise, practiced motion. Each stitch a tiny act of creation, of binding. The fabric drank the fur, incorporating it into its very being. The crimson stain on the wall intensified, a throbbing vein of color spreading across the plaster. It felt right, as if a missing organ was being grafted into place. The room, previously a cage, now felt like a vessel. A womb. The quilt breathed. A subtle expansion and contraction, a slow, deliberate inhale and exhale. It wasn't the rustling of fabric, but a deeper, more visceral movement. A pulse, a life. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of overripe peaches, the metallic tang of iron intensifying until it coated my tongue. It wasn't unpleasant. It was familiar. Like returning to a place I'd forgotten I knew. I continued stitching, the rhythm hypnotic. The table's heartbeat amplified, drowning out all other sounds. It wasn't just a sound, it was a pressure, a physical force. It pushed against my sternum, urging me onward. The embroidered wall seemed to lean inward, the stitches tightening, drawing the room closer, the boundaries blurred. The distinction between reality and representation dissolved. The quilt felt warm now, radiating heat. It wasn't the warmth of fabric, but the heat of a living thing. A slow, steady burn that spread through my fingertips, up my arms, into my chest. The golden fur, now woven into the quilt, seemed to shimmer with an internal light. A faint, phosphorescent glow that pulsed in time with a heartbeat. A memory surfaced unbidden. A childhood bedroom. A sun-drenched afternoon. The smell of lavender and dust. A feeling of profound, unshakable safety. A sanctuary. The quilt felt like that room. Like a return. The stitching was almost complete. Just a few more passes, a few more threads to bind the fragments together. The crimson stain on the wall pulsed, a beacon in the deepening gloom. It wasn't a stain anymore, but a map, a guide, a promise. I paused, the needle poised above the final stitch. A flicker of something. Doubt. No, not doubt, recognition. I knew what I was doing. I understood the purpose of this creation. I embraced it. The smile widened, a genuine, unsettling expression that stretched my lips taut. It felt natural. The final stitch, the needle pierced the fabric, a silent declaration. The quilt completed its breath, a long, shuddering exhale that seemed to rearrange the very air. The room shifted, not visually but perceptually. The angles altered, the proportions warped. The walls pressed closer, the ceiling lowered, the boundaries tightened. The quilt pulsed, the fabric vibrating against my hands. A low, resonant hum filled the room, a crystalline fang-ping that resonated deep within my bones. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling, a vibration, a confirmation. It echoed, not just within the room, but within me. The cycle completed. The loop closed. The clock ticked. The needle slipped through the fabric, a whisper of steel against the quilt surface. It wasn't T-resistance I felt, but a yielding, a welcome. The crimson stain on the wall pulsed, a slow, deliberate rhythm that mirrored the thrumming in my chest. The table, its heartbeat, once a distant echo, now resonated within me, a hollow drumbeat against my ribs. I hadn't smiled in. How long? The days bled into one another, marked only by the slow, agonizing progress of the embroidered wall. But now, a faint curve lifted the corners of my mouth. A genuine, unsettling smile. The cat watched, its golden fur shimmering in the wine, red light not a gaze of curiosity, but of approval. It was the missing piece. The final thread, the fur shed in those dissolving moments, clung to the quilt like powdered moonlight. It wasn't simply fur. It was a residue, a trace of something else. I gathered the filaments, tiny, almost invisible, and laid them upon the quilt as surface. The needle plunged again, a precise, practiced motion. Each stitch a tiny act of creation, of binding. The fabric drank the fur, incorporating it into its very being. The crimson stain on the wall intensified, a throbbing vein of color spreading across the plaster. It felt right, as if a missing organ was being grafted into place. The room, previously a cage, now felt like a vessel, a womb. The quilt breathed. A subtle expansion and contraction, a slow, deliberate inhale and exhale. It wasn't the rustling of fabric, but a deeper, more visceral movement. A pulse, a life. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of overripe peaches, the metallic tang of iron coating my tongue. Not unpleasant. Familiar, like returning to a place I'd forgotten I knew. I continued stitching, the rhythm hypnotic, the table as heartbeat amplified, drowning out all other sounds. It wasn't just a sound, it was a pressure, a physical force pushing against my sternum, urging me onward. The embroidered wall seemed to lean inward, the stitches tightening, drawing the room closer. Boundaries blurred, reality and representation dissolved. The quilt felt warm now, radiating heat. Not fabric warmth, but the heat of a living thing. A slow, steady burn spreading through my fingertips, up my arms into my chest. The golden fur, woven into the quilt, shimmered with an internal light. A faint phosphorescent glow pulsing in time with the heartbeat. A memory surfaced unbidden. A childhood bedroom. Sunday, drenched afternoon. The smell of lavender and dust. A feeling of profound, unshakable safety. A sanctuary. The quilt felt like that room. Like a return. The stitching was almost complete. Just a few more passes, The crimson stain on the wall pulsed, a beacon in the deepening gloom. It wasn't a stain anymore, but a map. A guide. A promise. I paused, the needle poised above the final stitch. A flicker of recognition, not doubt. Recognition. I knew what I was doing. I understood the purpose. I embraced it. The smile widened, a genuine, unsettling expression stretching my lips taut. It felt natural. The final stitch. The needle pierced the fabric, a silent declaration. The quilt completed its breath, a long, shuddering exhale that rearranged the very air. The room shifted, not visually, but perceptually. Walls pressed closer, ceiling lowered. Boundaries tightened. The quilt pulsed, fabric vibrating against my hands. A low, resonant hum filled the room, a crystalline, fistulin, resonating deep within my bones. Not a sound, but a vibration. A confirmation. It echoed within me. The cycle completed. The loop closed. I closed my eyes, the vibration deepening. The radio static modulated at 45 hertz, carrying the lullaby. Wet boots vibrate in the nursery, making my ears bleed with a dry scratching sound. The Tibetan bowl resonance faded. The air tasted of copper and crushed peaches. The quilt, as warmth seeped into my bones. I felt the walls lean in, the wine, red light thickening, the dark oak grain of the table surface humming under my palms. The scratching sound wasn't teat outside. It was the sound of the quilt stitching itself, the sound of the room breathing, the sound of the cycle beginning again, the cycle complete.